I am very pleased to introduce Elizabeth King. Beth is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a 3IE board commissioner. Previously, she was the World Bank's Director of Education for 6 years, where she was the technical head and senior spokesperson for global policy issues related to education. She also led the development of the bank's current education strategy and served as its senior representative in global partnerships on education. She has published articles in professional journals, books, and book chapters and blogs on topics such as investments in human capital, gender issues, and decentralization reforms. Welcome, Beth. Over to you. I'll be back again for the poll.
Thank you, Beryl. So this is the last session of the afternoon before the wonderful lecture by Gonzalo. Thank you very much, panel. Let me introduce the panel, which you will notice is a very different panel from the previous one. The previous one, you met researchers on social protection and the people who were there trying to design programs and even implement the programs. So our panel is quite different. Let me start with Sally Geer, who is at the end here. Sally is the head of profession for education of the UK Department of International Development, where she has been education advisor since 2006. Sally is also a lecturer, or she has lectured,
I used to be.
rather, in the past at Manchester University on social development, gender, and development. And she's worked at the British Council as an education advisor in Africa. And she was, I don't know what, is that VSO?
Yeah,
Volunteer
VSO. It's
Services
an international
Office.
NGO. Yeah,
Okay,
so I was an
right.
education
And
advisor
she
there a
was-
number of years back. Yeah.
And you were the education and gender advisor there. And she's currently also the chair of the Global Partnership for Education Committee on Grants Performance. Thank you for being here, Sally. And then we have to my right, George Kronisanyan Werner. I pronounced that right. Okay, from now on, I'll forget the middle name. And George, if I might call you by your first name, was formerly the Minister of Education of Liberia from 2015 to 2018. But he's now, I suppose he's no longer minister, and he's now with Big Win Philanthropy, assisting African leaders to implement transformative reform agendas in education, human capital in general, demographic reform, and economic growth. And to his right is Joo-Ho Lee, who, like George, was former minister, not of Liberia, but of South Korea. And Joo-Ho was Minister of Education, Science, and Technology. He was also a senior secretary to the President for Education, Science, and Culture, and he was a member of the South Korea National Assembly, and is the author of some books. I'm looking at his desk, but because he brought one book that I think he might be auctioning on human capital development in South Korea. But Joo-Ho also, in his term, was a big reformer, and I hope we will have a chance to hear about the reforms that he undertook while he was minister. And lastly, we have to Joo-Ho's right, Girindra Bihari, who is the Director of Global Education Learning Strategy at the Gates Foundation, and he leads the foundation's efforts to produce global public goods, such as data, evidence, innovation. So he's the right person to be in this room, I would say, for sure, because this is something that we would like to talk about. Girin, for short, was previously served as director of the Foundation's India Country Office, overseeing the Foundation's work on health, education, financial inclusion, and agriculture. And before that, he was the director of strategy of the Global Health Division of the Gates Foundation. And so Girin has actually had both education and health in his background. So So again, a nice mix in this, on this panel. So this is how we're going to do this conversation. So I will ask one broad question for all of you, and then I will start to just pick some questions that I will direct to each one of you, and then we will have a chance to ask the panel questions. So one of the most interesting things, I think, in the past 3 years is the publication of international reports on education. So you have the UNESCO Global Monitoring Education Report, which comes out every year, and that had something to do with improving accountability in the education sector. We had also in 2015, 2016, the Learning Generation Report of the International Commission for Financing Education Opportunities. And Juho was a commissioner on that commission. It was composed of heads of state, heads of UN agencies, and was chaired by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And then the most recent international report on education is the World Bank's World Development Report, the first one that focuses only on education, which is called Learning, Realizing the Promise of Education. The overwhelming message from these reports has been that we have a learning crisis. And the urgency expressed in this reform in these reports is that we have to acknowledge this learning crisis because the world we live in is different, partly because of technology, partly because of the social changes that are happening in the various countries, conflicts, fragile states, and so forth. And referring to the first one is the changing nature of jobs, which I think will resonate with this young audience. And there have been reports also on the changing nature of jobs from the ILO as well as from the World Bank. And if you would like to check those out, because they're actually very, very interesting reports. But you know, not everyone is actually convinced that we have a learning crisis. It's amazing. So what I'd like to ask our panel is what they think, what is the additional evidence that we need to actually convince ministers of countries, teachers, education officials, school leaders, that we do have a learning crisis and that we have to do something about that? Or is it really additional evidence that we need, in fact, to counter this resistance to the naming of this crisis? So let me start with you, George. As Minister of Liberia, thinking about that, what additional evidence do you think? And are you yourself convinced we have a learning crisis?
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Manny, and through you, 3i, for the invitation. And first, I'm convinced that we do have learning crisis. I'm not convinced only because I come from Liberia, where we're tackling this, but because I grew up on the continent of Africa, and I'm very familiar with what fellow African ministers are going through. So let me start with what we all seem to agree on. And today, some statistics first. There is increase in population. Today, there are, our focus on Africa, 420 million Africans between the ages of 15 and 35. That number, as you all know, is expected to nearly double to over 830 million by 2050. Population growth. We have also achieved something by way of access in education. Under the Millennium Development Goals, many countries made significant progress in increasing enrollment. And by 2015, enrollment in primary education in developing countries reached 91%. Increase in education expenditure. In a 2017 report, the World Bank highlighted that expenditure on education in sub-Saharan Africa has increased sevenfold over the past 30 years, yet the region continues to have the least skilled workforce globally. We have a learning crisis worldwide. There is little or deteriorating improvement in student achievement. And we are told that if we do nothing about it, nearly half of the world's children will be failing to learn by 2030. For me, that learning crisis means that there are students we are graduating who do not have the knowledge, the skills, and the values to meet the demands of the economy.
Thank you, George.
Yeah.
Juho?
So, learning crisis, I think, is not just confined to low and middle-income countries, but it also, South Korea, for example, has been long regarded as an exemplary country in education policies. We attained universal enrollment in elementary schooling in early 1960s. And in 1980, we attained universal basic education of 9 years of schooling. But universal enrollment is not the sufficient condition for learning. As George already mentioned, if you are in school, but learning may not happening. So I really think that the root cause of the learning crisis is not just about lack of quantitative expansion or something like that, but more fundamental one. You know that thinking about the typical classroom setting, where a teacher provides lectures to all the students in the classroom, but it's really uniform, and the teacher is delivering the content that already made by others. So it's not really a personalized learning experience. So many students, even in Korea now, less and less engaged, and they are saying that they are not happy in school. And although we really attain very high test score in PISA test, so every expert, OECD, saying that Korea is really the exemplary country, but I don't think we are not, because the high test score really mask the low abilities, other abilities that are not easily measured by the OECD or other agencies. So this learning crisis is not about just low and middle income countries, it's a global phenomenon. And it's really related to the more fundamental problem of learning model. So we are really searching for the new model that could replace the old model. Maybe 250 years ago, we started the old model. It paralleled the kind of a factory system of mass production in 19th century, but while all the other system has been evolving, but the school system is not really have been changed much. So that's the real cause of learning crisis that applied to every country.
So that's an interesting view. We've just heard from George from Liberia and also from Juho from South Korea. South Korea has consistently been, the students have consistently been testing in the top 5 countries. So that's sort of, and he's saying there's a global learning crisis. What do you say, Girin?
Yes. Hi everybody. Yeah, thanks, Beth. I'm Kiran. Thanks for the chance to come and talk to you all. So I'll answer your question very directly, which is there a learning crisis? Yes. I think it happens at every level of the school system. The one that we have most focused on in the last few months has been early stage, the foundational learning piece, which is quite critical for everything else you do. There's no way you can go to, unlike health, where if you don't go to primary healthcare system, you don't get cured, you go to the tertiary level. In education, if you go to primary school, you don't learn, you don't go to university, right? So there's a cumulative effect of education that's quite distinct between education and health, and that often we fail to appreciate. And the foundational piece of this is absolutely capital. If you can't read, you can't go anywhere. I think that piece is much appreciated now by the global community. How much this is sunken into global policy, into policy dialogues locally is the next question you ask, like what would it take to actually get that to the next level? The other end of the spectrum, though, is also the one that is affecting both middle income, high income, and low income countries, which is the one the minister was talking about, which is what is the value of the education we've been producing? So right now we think about secondary education in very kind of simplistic terms of we're going to continue putting kids through education system, and 12 years is better than 10, and 10 is better than 8. But when you have all these conversations happening about employment, livelihoods, future of work, is that system truly suited? Is it providing the kinds of skills that you need? Is another question that I think doesn't have the same focus today as it ought to have, but that's already there. So to come to your question about what would it take to convince people more about the learning crisis. So I happen to have been in India a month ago, where we were invited by this group called the Niti Aayog, which is the national it was a former planning commission in India. It is essentially the government of India's think tank, headed by very high-level economists, and they have a Monday morning meeting where they invite all their staff to talk about an issue. They invited a couple of us to talk about the education crisis in India, and we did what we said now. This is enrollment is better, learning is bad. And you could see the skepticism in the room, and I was trying to understand what is it that they didn't believe about this. So this is a country where you have had 10 years now of data from the citizen-led assessment, ASER. The government-owned data didn't quite match what the citizen-led assessment said, so therefore they tend to say, okay, our data says differently. So high-quality data is that they listen to makes it different of their own perception. But even the basic stuff I was talking about of, does foundational learning matter? And I think there were 2 or 3 things that impeded their ability to believe that. One was, well, if people are failing, what typically governments tend to look at is, high-stakes exams, end of primary, end of lower secondary, the pass rates for those exams are what is politically salient, what's what parents want to see, what's what schools want to see. And when you look at that as your common metric, then you ask the question, okay, I can fix that by having kids, then 1 or 2 grades below, just prop them up. The idea that this actually comes from early on in the system is not something that's, I think, accepted. And I think you have to shed light directly on that issue early on to be able to show that the kids that don't pass that first hurdle of being able to read never get anywhere. And I think that data, we showed them one piece of data that came from Karthik's work in Andhra Pradesh, where you saw the learning path of kids being quite steep from grade 1 and grade 2, and then completely flatten after grade 2, because that's the tip between learning to read and reading to learn. So up to now, the kids were able to maintain some level of proficiency, but then it tipped once the learning around reading tipped. So I think that capability of able to show how, in India, 6 months into grade 1, you've lost 47% of kids to numeracy and 42% of kids to literacy, in the sense that they cannot recognize a letter or a number. So if you go further, just imagine you're a 3rd grade teacher and your kids can't recognize a letter or a number. What are you going to do? Are you going to stop and teach those kids at the right level? Are you able to do that? So those kids are recently lost to the system early on. I think we don't have right now their ability to focus on that particular piece of the equation to demonstrate that. The other piece that I think is also important to bring to the table is how does this matter for things that people care about? So people care about right now is not foundational learning. This is a bunch of nerds like us talking about foundational learning, but it doesn't translate in terms of the policy discourse, which is much more about what am I going to do with those kids who are, I have now a bunch of kids who are finishing high school, finishing college, they can't get employment. So how can that help me address this issue? I think unless we're also able to link the conversation we want to have with the one where the dialogue is today, where the political energy is today, we're going to have a hard time penetrating through their resistance about this learning crisis.
Thank you, Corinne. Sally, you have not only been leading DFID's education profession, but you yourself have been working in Africa on the ground as an educator.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you to the organisers and for the invitation to be part of this very distinguished panel. I welcome that opportunity. I think all the points that others have raised are very valid. I mean, I think just to sort of add things to the mix, so on the, I think the first thing to say on the sort of learning crisis, I think it's also important to remember that within most countries everywhere, there are children that are learning very well. So there is a question here that I'd like to throw in about equity as well, and political will and care for learning for all. We did have a DFID education policy paper a while back. We've had a few, but this was in 2010, and it was entitled Learning for All. So I don't want us to lose that in this. When we sort of talk about global learning crisis, I think sometimes that can obfuscate that issue that there are inequities and opportunities to learn, and I think there is a question there about political economy and political will. So I think that's the first thing to say. And I think the second is, I think the environmentalists are very good. Again, it may be a bit dated, showing my age, that we used to talk a lot about global and local when it came to environmental issues. And I think these international reports are brilliant in raising the sort of awareness and advocacy. But when it comes to action and implementation and evidence, it then needs to be really owned at a local and national level. And I think, and I think we're increasingly realising that when we are looking to get evidence about what works in terms of improving learning outcomes in a particular country or local context, that has to very much be designed and owned by local agency and local institutions and national governments, and it's likely to be more effective. So there's not one side. We know, all of us here know that the key things, and we can go on to talk about those. But actually, how things play out in a particular context is really very important. And I suppose the final thing to say, although maybe is related to that, is that a lot of international research, I think, on learning outcomes is omits to include cost-effectiveness data, for example, and that's really key for policymakers in low-income countries. So again, this comes back to I think there is a sort of broad recognition there's this crisis, but getting that local and national ownership is very much around contextualising this, and also a little less of the finger pointing. I think I'm not a great fan of league tables. Okay, thanks.
I guess I'm not so surprised. Let me ask you to both former ministers of education, what evidence did you use for your, if yes, for your policy decision making? And did you find evidence that was actually relevant for the kinds of decisions that you were making? Were they available? Were they accessible? Were they, like Sally said, were they from national sources, or were you using data from international sources?
So there is a challenge on the ground, and I don't think that we've been able to address this yet. I heard about it by passing, but data ownership. Do governments own their own data? And do they have the capacity to interpret it, to store it, and to use whatever they can for policy? I remember when I got to the Ministry of Education, as many of you will recall, in the shadow of Ebola waning in our part of the world. We hadn't been in school for almost half a year. Schools were closed, parents were afraid to send their children back to school. And by January 2015, we were regaining our confidence to reopen schools. So the first thing I did when I was sent to the ministry in June of 2015 was to take a listening tour of the country. I went to every county. I went to schools, I talked to parents, I saw students, I saw teachers. And it gave me a qualitative experience of what kind of education people were looking for post-Ebola. They didn't want what was to be restored. They wanted something different. But I didn't stop there in terms of building the evidence. I knew what I was saying was not complete enough, so I went to the Global Partnership for Education, and I was on the board at the time. And I said, I need a grant to complete a comprehensive analysis of the education sector in Liberia. And with the support of the World Bank as the grant manager, we did all that. That gave me scientific evidence of what the problems were. And out of that came a strategy. And that was our approach in terms of using evidence for that. One of the things we, as education ministers, I know some in sub-Saharan Africa are not very good at doing is making a convincing, say, economic argument for the deficits in the education sector so as to gain the sympathy of the finance minister to give us the resources we need to implement education programs.
So as a member of National Assembly, the first thing I really have to have had a lot of efforts was the passing the law on information disclosure on education, because I believe in that information really matters, and the research based on the information that are released by the law could be very, very useful. So we really started evidence-based the education reform when I was in the ministry. But given that our real issue is fundamental change in education from the old 250 years old model to search for a new model, a new learning model, I cannot really find good evidence about new approaches. Maybe there are three kinds of new approaches. First one could be a high-touch model. So teachers, rather than giving the uniform lecture to same lecture to everyone in the classroom, maybe teachers can encourage project, discussions, or experience of students, be able to provide a personalized learning opportunity for every student. So this is high-touch model. But this requires insurmountable burdens of teachers. So how we can reduce the burden of teachers, it could be really important question. And the second approach is high-tech model. You can see the really amazing advancement of education technology in these years. The adaptive learning utilizing AI and big data, and immersive learning using VR and AR and gamification, and even social learning utilizing digital platforms. We can utilize a lot of cutting-edge education technologies, but they are out there, but not really within the school. So we try to find out the evidence, but it's really the new innovation. So what I really want to propose for the evidence community is that in those areas like education, that we really want to search for new ideas, new innovations, evidence could really should focus more on early stage of changes rather than looking back to the past experience.
Okay.
So yeah, that's
So we'll get to that, Juho, pretty soon. But I wanted to follow up with George. Now, the reforms you were doing, the changes you were making, were at a difficult time in Liberia, the Ebola crisis, as you said. Now, one of the things that people in government is now not known for is patience, and this was one of the lessons actually from the previous session. So, and researchers are not always the people who are on the same timeline as probably you were at. So how were you able to get, or were you able to get research in a timely manner?
Yes, but not without a push. Because once we completed the listening tour, front and center before me were the faces of girls and boys who wanted to learn badly. Parents who wanted to see their children in school. There was no way I was going to allow a 5-year education sector plan to delay those kids. And so I went back and thought, is there a way, an approach by which we can accelerate improved learning outcomes? Because Liberia is further behind its counterparts. So what do we do to leapfrog? And therefore, we thought about a public-private partnership for education. Our approach, and I was convinced, and I still say this today, governments are by and large incompetent at educating poor people. If it were possible, you wouldn't have the academies in the UK or the charter schools in the US. Governments are incapable, incompetent at educating poor people. So the coming together of proving methods in the private sector plus the regulatory and policy framework in government gave us a good public-private partnership for education, and we commissioned an independent evaluation, the Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA, the Center for Global Development. It was controversial because there are those who believe that the public provision of education should be for government alone. I just gave you statistics of overwhelming numbers for countries. We come from resource-constrained environments. You can give me the evidence I need, but if I don't have the money, it will be on my desk. So our approach was, how do we accelerate improved learning outcomes for children who are very poor? And thus, the PPP for education, and I'm encouraged that many governments are paying attention to that.
Thank you, George. Sally, any reaction to that?
Specifically just on those comments? Just on Liberia particularly. I think you've spoken, it's good to hear real experience on that. And I think the different modalities in terms of reaching children is definitely something that, certainly with DFID, we look at and look at the evidence around that. But I'd like to come back to the point you make about, having evidence in time. And I think that's a challenge for everyone in this room, because it's really when policy, the political cycle in any country is going to always change. And we have this in the UK, and if we had anyone here from the Department of Education who was an official, they would probably be saying the same, just leave us alone for a little while, because, and let policies embed. And obviously that's even more of a challenge in countries where resources are very low. I guess certainly from I'm not in your space and actually actively doing primary research anymore, but, from a policy perspective, I think we have to find ways of sort of being adaptive, and we're looking at that in DFID in terms of programming and being able to learn on the job, as it were. I used to, again, this shows my age, but I think it's called active learning or action research, that's right, and I'm sure that's around. And it was a lot, NGOs did it a lot, I was a great fan, actually, because it was really about sort of learning and then feeding that back into programming and then moving on. And I don't seem to see so much of that anymore. I guess it's because RCTs are so much in the fashion, which I have nothing against, by the way, just to put that on record. But just to see a bit more of that would be more useful, I think, in the education space, because no one knows the answers, particularly at these really difficult contexts where you have, situations like Ebola or conflict or refugee children, all these things. It's new, we need to be able to change and adapt. So, it would be good to see that coming up more in the education space. Thanks.
Gureen, I know that the Gates Foundation right now is developing your own education strategy in developing countries. What's your reaction to this discussion about timely, relevant, available evidence.
Yeah, so as we were trying to develop, what is it, and just to kind of like maybe say a word about this, so we are just new into this education space internationally. We have a very long-standing US education program that's quite large, but we're just entering international education in a very modest way, mostly from a research angle, like partly because we want to study it more as what's called a learning strategy, as opposed to we're not at this point funding programs or any of this stuff. So we had to ask the question, like, what kind of evidence, what kind of useful thing we can invest in as a foundation. And those elements are exactly right. I mean, the element of timeliness and the element of context specificity are two things that we need to add to the equation in addition to rigor. We tend to think about evidence equates rigor, but as important is the issue of timeliness, and as important is the issue of context specificity. So let me say a word about both of those pieces. So timeliness, I mean, just obvious, like again, my experience of being in India for 4 years and interfacing with policymakers all the time. So I never were in the shoes of my colleagues here, but interfacing with people like them. And it was very clear. I mean, you have, as a new minister, as a new secretary of education, you have, at best, 4 years, if you're very lucky, to be doing something. You have, so elections are coming up in 4 years. You're working back from there to say, okay, I need to have something done now in the next 6 months that I can do at scale. I need to scale pretty fast. It needs to scale in the next year so I can show results, that I can actually campaign on it or whatever it is that show results in the next 3 years. So that's the reality of it. And I think we need to work within this reality. I don't think we can say, I think I find Minister Werner was incredibly patient and trying to balance the rigor with the political imperative. If I were in his shoes, I don't know that I would have been as attentive to evidence as he was. I think it's a huge element of how do you actually connect the dots with that. And with that comes the difficulty of the data has to be context specific. I mean, I was very intrigued by IIIE's report last year. The meta study that you all did was very good. I mean, we read all these documents. And what it says to you is like every intervention you take will have a context in which it will work and other ones in which will not work. I mean, except for two things, cash transfers for access and pedagogical practices for learning. That's my summary of the study. But everything else crosses the zero line. At some point you will find a case where it worked, a case it hasn't worked, a case where it worked with a government but not with an NGO with not a government, it worked in Pakistan but not in India.
Yes.
So what does it mean for me? So can I draw from that inference, the global inference, the average effect sizes? I mean, as the joke goes, you can drown in a pool that's on average 3 feet deep. It depends on where you are on the pool, right? So I think the need to come with context-specific information, the need to interpret that data, the need to say, okay, in your context, given your conditions, what is the likelihood of this happening is something that's very difficult. And the third part is what Sally was saying, which is like, given those conditions, often you're bound to do something very suboptimal from the rigor perspective. That is much more about emergent learning from messy programs. And what is the mechanism you need to build around that to do that kind of learning as you go forward? So this is a little bit the trade-off we have to make. So some of the work we're trying to do is in the spirit of that, of saying, can we develop approaches taking a little bit off the pedal on the rigor, but in terms of relevance, in terms of who's asking those questions today, can we come in and provide the best possible answer, knowing that it will be messy and knowing it will need to follow up over time. So that's a bit of philosophy.
So let me ask something more specific about that, because I think George mentioned an issue that still seems to be an issue of debate, which is this public-private partnership in the delivery of education. And I presume you meant basic education. So I want to turn to you both, Sally and Girin, about picking up these topics for debate in the field, and what is the willingness of and the readiness of the Gates Foundation, as well as DFID, for taking on these difficult research questions and policy questions, actually.
Well, I mean, from DFID's perspective, I mean, I think we've always said in terms of delivery, we've got sort of no ideological view of, of sort of education delivery to a certain extent. So it's very much evidence-based. And just to give a recent example, we brought some ministers over to London a couple of weeks ago, and we put together something called the Global Dialogue, and we had a lot of information sharing about how the UK has approached the academies, and how that's evolved over time, and how they've now become much more sort of like almost like mini LEAs in certain, and the pros and cons of that. I mean, I think the most important thing here, though, is coming back to context, actually, in that it's really important that we're not saying, because we certainly have made mistakes in the UK on developing this model, and I'm sure, I'm not an expert on the US, but I'm sure people would say the same in terms of the research on charter schools. So it's really important that we're honest about sharing that, and I suppose, as you know, our approach should be very much an evidence-based lesson learning rather than this is the best model to reach the poorest. So I think that, that's what I've really got to say on that. But I guess maybe a foundation may have a more detailed answer.
So there's no idea from our side to promote any particular approach. So we're not saying, go do PPP is going to solve your system, right? And if you look at the matrix of funding and provision, so you have public government systems, public-private PPPs, and private-private, which are private schools. Then if you are a government, the question you're asking yourself is like, what is the suite of tools I have at my disposal to improve learning across those three sectors? And is turning some of these private schools into PPP schools a helpful thing to do? So what we are keen to see, and to be honest, the literature on this one is very complicated and very messy. It's actually very thin to begin with. When you look at the PPP context, ARC did a study for DFID a couple of years ago, and it was like 10 studies that passed any level of rigor, right? And what they showed you is on margin, you have a better result, but often because it costs far less to run PPP schools than it costs government schools because of teacher salaries. But in terms of outcome, it barely outperforms them, especially when you control for socioeconomic factors. So it's not, we're not entering the space with a view to saying, this is the answer. We're certainly willing to say, let's look at this evidence here. People like Jushna would say, the moment you try to endogenize the benefits of private schooling into government by funding it, you lose the benefit of what made them good in the first place, because you're changing their accountability mechanism from the short one, which is parents to schools, to the long one, which is government to schools, which is messes it up quite significantly. So it's not an easy answer to be able to say, let's go promote private schools. I think we need to take a considered look at that.
Thank you. Let me change tack here. Juho started to take us to the next stage, or the next decade maybe. So let's make believe it's 2028 instead of 2018, okay? It's 2028, we've gathered here, and we're talking about education research. First, let's imagine, what does that school in 2028 going to look like? We are in a tech-rich, tech-savvy world. What is the relationship going to be between the technology then and education? We know from the research that the systematic review that 3IE did, that there are not many studies at all that look at technology and education and whether they say the same things. Because I think the research is quite mixed in terms of the impact of technology in the classroom, in the hands of students, in the hands of teachers. So let's take a look at what do we need to know now. We need to, so if we think that that is the future, that there's going to be more technology in education, it makes sense, it seems to me, that we should be investing in this field even now to try to learn what are the models that that we need to think about. Juho, you've already introduced high touch and high tech. So I'm not going to turn to you right now. I want to take, because I know you're going to tell us more about that, and you can respond to, I want to go to Sally, who knows about, and then to George, who knows about the reality of the classroom, because people who are the most resistant to to this idea of technology in learning are really the people who know that even though you have mobile phones in the hands of kids, even in the poorest areas, first, those mobile phones are not smartphones. It's difficult to get internet connectivity and so forth and so on. So there are all of these obstacles to this view of the classroom being tech-rich and students being tech-savvy. Sally, may I turn to you?
Yes, sure. Hope I'll be around in 2028 so, to be able to.
We hope to all be around.
Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, just to say from DFID's perspective, we're already investing in this space. So I think there may be people are aware we're launching a new £20 million research programme on EdTech and the use of EdTech. So really aware that this is an area that we need to be on the front foot of, and particularly around research and evidence. As you know, we all know there's not enough research and evidence. And I think it's quite interesting, actually, in the UK experience. I was at a conference a while back, and it's still not... it's sort of like 80% or even less than that schools still who haven't actually got access to technology. So it's, we're still in the learning phase, I think, in the UK in terms of the use of that. And it's very different in different parts of the country and in different communities. I suppose from my perspective, the most important thing is using technology. It's sort of what do we want children to learn? And technology is a tool. It's not a means to it's not an end in itself. And I think that's really key. And the limited evidence that is around is where it has been used. A teacher knows what they want to teach, and the use of some form of technology may well be part of that lesson plan. So it's not hey, we've got all this tech, we've got to use it. It's how will this and the second question is actually doing it this way through technology an improvement from doing it through a textbook or doing it through a pair group work or a group work or peer-to-peer learning. So for me, that's absolutely key. I think technology is really interesting at the moment live in terms of data collection, actually, is particularly in low-income countries. This idea, coming back to our last point, actually, we've really struggled with having actually robust data that's live for governments to be able to use, and obviously technology is really going to help that. So that's a really important use. I think maybe looking 10 years hence. I think what may well be interesting is that actually the sort of use of technology will be a skill in itself. So moving from this actually, as even in my own experience as a parent of a 11 and 13-year-old, I'm absolutely aware if they don't leave school being able to use technology really well, they're going to be disadvantaged in the workplace. So from seeing it as a technology as something to help improve teaching and learning, it will, I think, increasingly become something that was actually content that actually, and it's moving in the curriculum here actually into now students are learning programming, etc., because it's a really core 21st century skill. So in a way, I think that's where we'll see the trajectory move. But yes, there's lots to learn. I think we need to be open-minded, those of us as a certain generation, because it's here. I think a big challenge for us at the moment in the work, and when I say us, I'm talking about DFID now in terms of our programs in our partner countries, is actually also the capacity building around. There's a lot of international companies actually some of it, I'm sad to say, is doing no harm actually in terms of technology that may not be that relevant, may not deliver value for money, may not be sustainable, and we also have the equal challenge of electricity and connectivity, which is very obviously it seems to me, but sometimes that is something that's not factored in when we do this research. So a lot of our work is around that as well, just supporting our partners to be able to get the best opportunities available. So that's also a factor, I think, in this debate. Thanks.
George, what do you see in Liberia happen with this technology in the classroom?
Well, if I drew a triangle, I would have at each of the three ends students, teachers, assessments, and the overlay of all that will be resources. the common tool to all of those will be technology as a way of enhancing delivery. So I see the school of the future for teachers, whether you call them teachers by that time or facilitators. I see them, as Sally said, being trained to have the skill in terms of the use of technology for themselves and for interacting with students. I see students likewise learning how to use technology as a source of enhancing knowledge and skill for the world of work. And for assessments, evidence development, what are we assessing? We are assessing that teachers are really doing what they are doing, and that students are learning with results, and that we can turn best practice into common practice to benefit the entire. One of the things I find intriguing, and we're talking about the relationship between medicine and education, or health and education, is the fact that in health, more and more, when you do an RCT for a particular type of medication, if it's good for the treatment, you make it available to the control. In education, no, there are arguments not to make what is best practice available to as many as we can. In health also, I see that more and more medications are using targeted therapy. Your gene is being sequenced to know what type of medication is good for you, right? I hope the school of the future is able to see every child as unique and teaching tailored to every child in the same way.
Thank you, George. And that is an excellent entry for what Joe is going to say.
Okay, thank you. So when I was tried several projects, and one of the best projects that have been evaluated was the MICE High School project. It's the project of overhauling the curriculum and teacher capabilities in vocational high school. So the first thing we did was we invited the former CEOs of major industries, to lead the school as principals. And also we invite the industry experts to redesign the whole curriculum of vocational high schools. And they also invite teachers to the companies during the vacation times to be trained every year so that they can be equipped with cutting-edge technologies. So those vocational schools turn into, we named it MICE High School, MICE High School for the robots, MICE High School for new media contents, MICE High School for the softwares. So those students, you know that usually in many countries, vocational high school has been regarded as inferior to general high schools, where graduates are advancing to universities. But now in Korea, top 30% or 50% students are now opt to choose MICE High schools. So this could be a really good example how to harness technology in the classroom. And the second point that I really want to emphasize here is that we know that the technology alone cannot make a huge impact, and there has been numerous studies that may be mixed, showing the mixed results of introducing technologies into the classroom. But if it were combined with changes in teachers' roles, teachers' pedagogies, it could be really the enormous change maker. So we thought that high touch, high tech. So when you combine high tech with high touch, that could really provide the best learning results. But we don't have not yet enough evidence about this. As George already talked about it, in the era of new search for the new learning models, we really have to encourage innovators to try again and again, like the innovators, startup companies in economic ecosystem. But in ecosystem of education, most teachers are just delivering the already made content. So then how we can really encourage trials, the innovations, and so forth. And also, we really have to have rigorous evidence. I really firmly believe in the importance of evidence when you take those innovations to scale. Otherwise, nobody believes you, right? So, so that's why I really suggest that we have to co-design evaluation scheme and innovation scheme together, so that the innovators they really want to show that they want to really prove their the outcomes, but it's not really easily accessible for them to have a good evaluation schemes. So the agency for impact evaluation really should work together with innovators in the early stage of innovation. Otherwise, you cannot, many innovators already failed in the classroom or do not have any chance to make impact. So, so particularly in the area of education, where the radical change is so important, and where we have to encourage innovators to try high-touch, high-tech model, for example, then we really have to gather more evidence how we can do this.
Thank you. Now, George mentioned health earlier and studies in health. Do you have a sense of why, in fact, if you did look at the body of evidence on impact evaluation in health and compare that with a body of evidence in education, we know that there's a bigger body in health, on health research, health evaluation findings. Do you have a sense of why this is, and how what have the obstacles been, and how, what do we need to do to expand the body of evidence in education? And I want to start with, maybe I'll start with Girin.
Can I also maybe add a couple of lines on the previous question?
Oh, yes, please.
Tech. So I think the trends are going to be mobile phones and smartphones will become more and more ubiquitous, including, at least at the household level, you will find many countries that we're looking into will have a smartphone of some sort. Second, I think it would be, in some ways, a pessimistic view is like EdTech has been around forever. The chalk is an innovation, the book is an innovation, the loudspeakers and the TV is an innovation, and all of them in some ways have failed to materialize the promise of EdTech. But maybe I remain not optimistic by saying that the new possibilities of EdTech today are quite distinct from what we have seen before. And certainly even the one laptop per child thing, which was very much focused on hardware, failed completely because I think their approach of that's not how you learn. Giving me a computer doesn't allow me to learn. You actually need to learn in a sequence, in a scoped way. You need to think about how the pedagogical approach to this needs to be integrated with the classroom practice and so on. So I think there are new possibilities, including personalized learning, that simply didn't exist before. So I think we're going to see more of that trend going forward. Third is, it's happening today. So recently we did a rapid scan of EdTech products in India, and there was 4,600 of them. And if you look at places like Kenya, there's a mushrooming group of people doing interesting work on technology. And the fourth thing is we are beginning to see new data, to your point, on tech coming through. That data, though, I would be surprised if it were, we've seen recently, for example, MindSpark, which was an RCT, and now MindSpark is a global superstar and featured everywhere. But MindSpark, I would say, is an exception in the sense of very few EdTech companies would put themselves up for that kind of evaluation, not partly because they are often startups, often trying to make a case, and often more than willing to adapt their technology to make it better. So if you come to me 5 years later and say you haven't worked, that kills me commercially. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather be in a mode of actually learning alongside you, which is why I think the DFID approach that they are taking is super interesting, which is not purely impact evaluation. It is some impact evaluation for things that are done at scale, but mostly is what they call rapid cycle evaluation, where you actually are working alongside the developers. So you cause them to reorient the product as you develop them. So that's the trend. I see three kind of like question marks for me about the EdTech thing going forward. One is, there's a view that, EdTech is the solution, therefore let's work with technology and out of school. I think even those of us here who have kids and who have technology access, who have Khan Academy at home, still send their kids to school. So I don't think that there is a view that one can substitute schooling by technology. I think it is a good supplement, but not a substitute. And I think the question of like, how do you get technology to be used in the classroom? And the other part about the split between out-of-school advocates and in-school advocates is often, for me, goes back to a point that Sally was making earlier about equity. I mean, the people who are going to use the technology is my kid, not the kid who needs it most, right? So do you want the most motivated, the upper middle income people to be using technology, or do you also want to find ways in which to bring that in the fabric of the classroom system? And to go from technology to learning is a very long value chain. And I think that value chain is, we've seen more and more data coming through on that front of like, what does it take for actually that to translate into learning? What does it take for a teacher to be able to use technology in the classroom? Remember that the teacher in many of the schools we have has a textbook. That's their transacted curriculum. That's how they operate. That's where the teachers. So how do you actually make use of a video somewhere in the ether, in the cloud, in the context that I'm teaching you this, without completely like causing whiplash in terms of pedagogy, in terms of. So that's, I think, a big question that is very interesting for us to look into. How do we bring technology to the classroom, not just simply outside the classroom? The second one is technology for teachers and for students. Super interesting stuff happening on both ends. The personalized learning stuff obviously requires a one-to-one to student method, but it's much more expensive, it's much more, and MindSpark is an instance of that. The other one is teacher for technology for teachers, which is often can be in the form of supporting teachers in the classroom. When you have low capability teachers, it can almost like bypass training programs by causing the teacher to have a scripted lesson plan and so on. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying it can provide support to the teachers in the classroom in a way that we haven't been able to see before and get feedback loops to the teachers rather rapidly. So we've seen that in Tusome, for example, happen. And then the third one is technology is another way of saying, for example, if you talk about student-facing technology, that is another way of teaching at the right level. It's saying, I'm going to adapt my teaching to your level. But that teaching at the right level is also what we see in other methods that are non-tech. So Pratham's method is teaching at the right level. So if those methods that are being introduced in a system are facing system rejections, we better understand why the system is not able to adapt those things at scale and make sure that as we think about technology, we're also thinking about the systems pieces that are enablers for those technologies to be implemented. And then there's that's one of the big questions I think we need to figure out of like, are these technologies changing their system dynamics, or are they entering a system dynamic that will eat them alive? The way they are eating alive other interventions that may be introducing the same system? That's the third question. So I haven't answered your question, which is the health one.
That's okay. That was a rich discussion of that. Yes. Go ahead.
On the health one, I don't know. I mean, for me, there's like a biomedical aspect of health that's just simply what it is. Like a vaccine is a vaccine is a vaccine. I can pretty much say that if vaccine works here, obviously patchy oral vaccines, which have different gut reaction and not the same effect, but parenteral vaccines will work pretty much everywhere. And therefore, there's some external validity that comes with that. In education, but whereas in health, when you go away from the biomedical interventions, then you become like health, you become like education. They are like things like training health frontline workers. It works, it doesn't work, it may work, it may not work. Same for teachers. So I think they become more, they look more like each other than we think, except the minority of things in health, which are, I think, more stable across geographies. That's my short and naive answer.
Yeah. Well, I asked the question because I've heard this allegation made quite a few, the statement made quite a few times that, oh, look at health, right? There's a lot of research there, there's et cetera. So it's interesting to hear what you have to say about that.
You want me to say?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think it's really building on what you've just said, really. I think there are some fundamental differences, and which sort of lend themselves to more sort of scientific approaches to trialing. every child learns differently. I mean, that's the fact. So, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, there's certain generalizations you can make, but there's a lot of, you know, there is so many factors going into an individual's child's learning that, you know, you aggregate that up. It's so I think, you know, they're the obvious ones. I mean, there are, you know, there is, of course, the political economy argument of the money, you know, the pharmaceuticals. That's where a lot of money goes into health. So you need to factor all of that out before you start making the sort of comparison. So, I mean, that's all I'll add on that.
Thank you, Sally. We do have a lot of questions. So one is, I think for you, George, on that teacher development versus teacher quality kinds of interventions versus approaches to teacher-proof the classroom. And then there's a question about more culture specificity, question about public-private, the findings from the impact evaluation of Liberia. There was a question about how do we change education so that we in fact enhance the non-market returns to education, that there are those other things that education has to produce in order to make education serve the country and society. And then there was a question about, well, low technology, whether we like it or not, will enter the classroom. And what do we do? What do we do about that? And the question about in 2028, the labor market's going to look different. There will be more than one just traditional classroom. What are the other things that you see happening to education? Lots of questions. So just.
So let me, in 1 minute, try to respond to 3. The question about teacher development, I gave you example about Liberia. Liberia went through civil war for 14 years, during which we lost our teachers. Some of them were killed, others fled the country. So after the war, the available went to the classroom. They were not trained. They didn't have any particular qualifications. We just needed bodies in the classroom to teach. Now we tested them, and we found there are some that are unteachable and should not be in the classroom. So, and there are others that need to be supported. And I found that the scripted lesson is good for that particular group of people that need support. So the two are not mutually exclusive. You can use both of them. Number 2, the current on that is now called LEAP. It used to be Partnership Schools for Liberia. The new government, and part of the evidence was, I was in a hurry to get the evidence because I wanted to prove to the new government that it was working. So the new government adapted the substance of the program, but renamed it for ownership as LEAP, Liberia Educational Advancement Program. To date, there are 190 schools in all the 15 counties of Liberia, serving 50,000 children. The impact evaluation is still ongoing. I don't have any update apart from what the Center for Global Development published on the first. And lastly, I know UNIDO, we're trying to partner with you in Liberia on this, on TVET. But let me tell you, in terms of what countries are doing, I do know because I was just there, Rwanda and Kenya are piloting 2 things that I think will revolutionize education. One, South Africa tried it and failed. It was called outcomes-based education. Rwanda and Kenya are calling it competency-based education and early childhood, primary levels. The idea is that you begin to teach children, develop skills over time in certain things to become independent. And so they also have TVET tracks, Ethiopia too. At a certain grade, you say after grade 9, you can choose whether or not you want to go TVET or not. What is missing, and this is where the evidence community comes in, I'm struggling to find tools for competency-based education evaluation.
Thank you.
And that's what the ministers need help with.
Thank you. May I ask Sally and Girian to answer the question about this non-market returns to education? How does education have to change in order to to get kids, our young people ready for, a broader set of realities that they have to be prepared for. And I will ask you, Juho, something else.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I think, we have focused on those for a reason, and that's because certainly in many of the countries that we work in DFID, the sort of level of learning outcomes for the majority are so low in terms of literacy, and I think some would argue actually if you don't even have that basic literacy, those other bigger things, the opportunity to read books, to expand your horizons, to all of those things. So I think, there is that side of the argument. So I think, obviously and we have the debate in the UK, we've got a hugely crowded curriculum, so even space for music and those sorts of things happen to come outside. So I don't think it's just a low-income country question, to be honest. But I think it's important to make that clear that, it's not that we don't think those things are important. It's just that in, we have a certain sort of budget, I guess, for education, and I guess in these contexts, because the levels are so low, we have, that is got to be the priority, I guess. Yeah.
Gary?
A bit of that's what I said. There are two learning crises. One is the foundational learning piece, which remains true. Reading is future-proof. I don't care what future of work looks like. You need to read to be able to be. And South Africa, comes last in Pearls regularly. And if you are the part of 9th, 10th deciles in South Africa, that are the 9th, 10th bottom decile, you have a worse education than if you had gone to Tanzania or Kenya. So I think we have very fundamental things to address, even in places which are middle income, even in places which are looking at addressing the more difficult issues you mentioned around what is this education about, what am I going to develop the kids for.
Thank you very much, Giri. Juho, I want to recast a bit the question from Carola. I think the question there is that even if we talk about technology writ large, right, both the simple one as well as the more sophisticated one, there's a need to actually sort of right size or to fit the technology to the specific context of the country, of the classroom, but also to the student, because you have students who are very in a disadvantaged areas. You have children with intellectual challenges and physical disabilities, and so how to think about technology in the classroom.
So there are very, very diversified rising demands on teachers to provide really various needs of students these days. So when you embrace technologies, basically adaptive learning technologies recently improved very fast. These technologies can provide services that teachers used to do. So teachers can be freed up to do different things. Maybe the things that they really want to do. So to focus more on students with problems, students lagging behind, or as Ian suggested, the learning opportunity for becoming better citizen, for example. So it's not about test score. These days, teachers are too much pressured to show the higher test score, but these jobs could be done by machines. And teachers can really focus on human beings' roles, taking care of children and making better citizens. So that's why, while we are doing a really big progress in technologies, and if we do not allow technology in the classroom, teachers are too much overburdened and fail to provide the really important things that they used to do in the previous years. So that's why combining technologies and making change in the roles of teachers are really an important issue right now.
I prepared last words for the panel, but I know that we've run out of time. So please join me in giving thanks to the members of the panel and congratulations to them.